reached out to the ranchers. Men, for instance, who never left their house without carrying their rifle. And they persuaded them to leave the guns at home and to come out and engage in nonviolent manifestations, even after plainclothes men on rooftops shot at the place called Change Square that they had set up in Sana'a.
That kind of policy planning was embodied in Mike Pence not standing up the other day in Pyeongchang. Stand up, you're in the host country. Would he have done that in Latvia? I don't know. They're white. But there's this, we can denigrate Asia, and they couldn't possibly come up with a nuclear weapon.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on over 30 cable stations from Maine to New York City, on the internet at thestruggle.org. As the bloody king of Saudi Arabia prepares to visit the UK and the US, return to a forum on the Saudi attack on Yemen at the Stony Point Center in New York State. The first speaker was Kathy Kelly, co-founder of Voices for Creative Nonviolence and a Gandhi Peace Award winner.
So thank you very much to Aaron, who apparently had asked the question, what are we going to do about Yemen? And that was part of what generated our gathering here today. And Susan, thank you so much for inviting me to come and picking me up to the Stony Point Center people. It's a privilege to be here with you, and certainly likewise to all who've come and to be with these colleagues. I think the urgency of our gathering tonight is indicated by the words that Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, spoke on a nationalized, televised speech in Saudi Arabia on May 2nd of 2017, when he said, a prolonged war is in our interest regarding the war in Yemen. He said, time is on our side regarding the war in Yemen. And I see that as particularly urgent because it's likely that the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who is by all accounts the orchestrator of the Saudi-led coalition's involvement in prolonging the war in Yemen, is going to come to the United States. In Britain, they managed to push back his arrival there. There was such a strong movement led by young Quakers, actually, in the UK. And he probably will come to the United States, and most certainly, if that trip happens, to New York. And I think that gives us an opportunity to say to him and to all of the people focused on him that time is not on the side of the civilians who suffer desperately, and their situation will be described much further throughout the course of our evening together. I've been asked to speak a bit about the war, the history of the war, and the proxy wars and the causes. And I want to say most humbly to Abdur that I know that any child in the Yemeni marketplace selling peanuts on the corner will always know more about the culture and the history of Yemen than I ever can. Something I've learned over the years with Voices for Creative Nonviolence is that if we wait till we're perfect, we'll wait a very long time. So I'll just jump in. And I think one place to start is with the Arab Spring. As it began to unfold in 2011, in Bahrain, at the Pearl Mosque, the Arab Spring was a very, very courageous manifestation. Likewise in Yemen. And I mostly want to say that young people in Yemen risked their lives beautifully to raise grievances. Now, what were those grievances that so motivated people to take very valiant stances? Well, they're all true today. And they're things that people can't abide with. Under the 33-year dictatorship of Ali Abdullah Saleh, Yemen's resources were not being distributed and shared in any kind of equitable way with Yemeni people. There was an elitism, a cronyism, if you will. And so problems that should never have been neglected were becoming alarming. One problem was the lowering of the water table. You don't address that and your farmers can't grow crops and the pastoralists can't herd their flocks. And so people were becoming desperate. And desperate people were going to the cities. And the cities were becoming swamped with people, many more people than they could accommodate in terms of sewage and sanitation and healthcare and schooling. And also in Yemen, there were cutbacks on fuel subsidies, and this meant that people couldn't transport goods, and so the economy was reeling from that. The unemployment was going higher and higher, and young university students realized there's no job for me when I graduate, and so they banded together. But these young people were remarkable also because they recognized the need to make common cause, not just with the academics and the artists who were centered in, say, Taiz, or with the very vigorous organizations in Sana'a, but they reached out to the ranchers. Men, for instance, who never left their house without carrying their rifle. And they persuaded them to leave the guns at home and to come out and engage in nonviolent manifestations even after plainclothes men on rooftops shot at the place called Change Square that they had set up in Sana'a and killed 50 people. The discipline these young people maintained was remarkable. They organized a 200-kilometer walk, walking side by side with the ranchers and the peasantry, the common people, and they went from Taiz to Sana'a. Some of their colleagues had been placed in terrible prisons, and they did a lengthy fast outside the prison. I mean, it sounds as though they had Gene Sharp's table of contents and were going through the nonviolent methods they could use. And they were also just spot on about the main problems Yemen was facing. They should have been given a voice. They should have been included in any negotiations. People should have blessed their presence. They were sidelined. They were ignored. And then civil war broke out. And the means that these young people had tried to use became all the more dangerous. Now, I want to comment that at this point in southern Yemen, the United Arab Emirates, part of the Saudi-led coalition, are running 18 clandestine prisons. Among the methods of torture, documented by Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, is one in which a person's body is trussed to a spit that rotates over an open flame. So when I ask myself, well, what happened to those young people? Well, when you're facing possible torture, imprisonment from multiple groups, when chaos breaks out, when it becomes so dangerous to speak up, I know that I, for my safety and my security, have to be very careful about asking, well, where is that movement? I want to go back to the history of Ali Abdullah Saleh. Because of some very skilled diplomats, and because of the Gulf Corporation Council, which was various countries represented this council in the Saudi Peninsula, and because people by and large who were part of these elites didn't want to lose their power, Saleh was edged out. A very skillful diplomat, his name was Al-Aryani, was one of the people who managed to get people to come to a negotiating table, but these students, the Arab Spring representatives, the people representing these various grievances, were not included. And so as Saleh more or less went out the door after his 33-year dictatorship, he said, well, I will appoint my successor, and he appointed Abdurabu Mansur Hadi. Hadi is now the internationally recognized president of Yemen, but he's not the elected president. There was never an election. He was appointed. At some point after Saleh had left, there was an attack on his compound. Some of his bodyguards were wounded and killed. He himself was wounded, and it took him months to recover, and he decided that's it. He decided to make a compact with people he had formerly persecuted and fought against, who were amongst the group called the Houthi rebels. And they were well-equipped. They marched into Sana'a, took it over. The internationally elected president, Abdurabu Mansur Hadi, fled. He is still living in Riyadh, and that's why we talk about a proxy war now. The civil war continued, but in March of 2015, Saudi Arabia decided, well, we'll enter into that war and represent Hadi's governance. And when they came in with a full cache of weaponry, and under the Obama administration, they were sold. And Boeing, Raytheon, these major corporations love to sell weapons to the Saudis because they pay cash on the barrelhead. They were sold for combat littoral ships. Littoral meaning they can go along the side of a coastline, and the blockades went into effect, which greatly contributed towards starvation, toward an inability to distribute desperately needed goods. They were sold a Patriot missile system. They were sold laser-guided missiles. And then very importantly, the United States said, yes, when your jets go up to do the bombing sorties that will be described by my colleagues here, we will refuel them. They can go over, bomb Yemen, come back into Saudi airspace. The U.S. jets will go up, refuel them in midair. Nick can talk more about that. And then you can go back and bomb some more. Iona Craig, a very respected journalist from Yemen, has said that if the mid-air refueling stopped, the war would end tomorrow. So the Obama administration was very, very supportive. But at one point, 149 people had gathered for a funeral. It was a funeral for a very well-known governor in Yemen, and the double tap was done. The Saudis first bombed the funeral, and then when people came to do rescue work, to do relief, a second bombing. And the Obama administration said, that's it. We can't guarantee that you're not committing war crimes when you hit these targets. Well, by then they had already bombed 4 Doctors Without Borders hospitals. Keep in mind, the United States had bombed the Doctors Without Borders hospital October 2nd, 2015, October 27th. The Saudis did it. Ban Ki-moon tried to say to the Saudi Brigadier General Azeri, you can't go around bombing hospitals. And the general said, well, we'll ask our American colleagues for better advice about targeting. So think about the green lighting that Guantanamo creates when the United Arab Emirates has a network of 18 clandestine prisons. Think about the green lighting that our bombing of a Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders hospital creates, and then the Saudis do it. We have played an enormous role, we as United States people, whose governance has been involved steadily in the civil war and the Saudi-led coalition war. We can call that a proxy war also because of the involvement of 9 different countries, including Sudan. How is Sudan involved? Mercenaries. Feared Janjaweed mercenaries are hired by the Saudis to fight on up the coast. So when the Crown Prince says time is on our side, he knows that those mercenaries are taking small town after small town after small town, getting very close to the vital port of Hodeidah. He knows that they've got loads of weapons and more coming because our President Trump, when he went over to dance with the princes, promised that the spigot is back on and the United States will again sell weapons. I want to close by mentioning that when, a little over a year ago, President Trump gave an address to both houses of Congress, he lamented the death of a Navy SEAL. And the Navy SEAL's widow was in the audience. She was trying to maintain her composure. She was crying bitterly. And he shouted over the applause that went on for 4 minutes as all the senators and all the congressmen gave this woman a standing ovation. It was a very strange event. And President Trump was shouting, he'll never be forgotten. He's up there looking down on you. Well, I began to wonder, where was he killed? And nobody ever said during the whole of that evening presentation that Chief Petty Officer Ryan Owen was killed in Yemen. And that same night, in the village, a remote agricultural village of Al Ghayal, Navy SEALs who had undertaken an operation suddenly realized we're in the middle of a botched operation. The neighboring tribespeople came with guns and they disabled the helicopter that the Navy SEALs had landed in. And a gun battle broke out. The Navy SEALs called in air support. And that same night, 6 mothers were killed and 10 children under age 13 were among the 26 killed. A young 30-year-old mother, her name was Fahim, had not known what to do when a missile tore through her house. And so she grabbed one infant in her arm and she took the hand of her 5-year-old son and she started shepherding the 12 children in that house that had just been torn apart outside because she thought that was the thing to do. And then who knows, maybe, the heat sensors picked up her presence emerging out of the building. She was killed by a bullet at the back of her head. Her son described exactly what happened. And because I think of American exceptionalism. We only know of one person, and we don't even know where he was killed on that night. And so to overcome that exceptionalism, to reach out the hand of friendship, to say that we do not believe time is on the side of any child at risk of starvation, disease, and their families who simply want to live. Time is not on their side. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone have a burning question for Kathy?
The site SaudiUS.org has complete video of the Yemen forum, as well as a page linked to petitions calling for Trump to keep Prince Salman out of the country, and information about preparations being made for protests when Salman is allowed in. Supposedly, he's coming to MIT and Wall Street. As Assad bombards Eastern Ghouta and turns it into rubble, some people refuse to stay silent. These are pictures from Chicago, and these are from Moscow. We have to be creative. We have to think of measures of BDS against Russia. One thing that comes to mind is a campaign to keep the Russian airliner Aeroflot out of the United States until Russian planes and personnel stop participating in the bombing in Syria. They shouldn't have landing rights for Russian planes in the U.S. Last week we featured Professor Alexis Dudden at the teach-in against a new Korean war. One of the things she talked about was Trump's schoolboy threat of a bloody nose for North Korea. More of her thoughts from the teach-in.
And hopefully the global community can watch these Olympics and say, look, here's the chance. Let's work together with Korea as the world community to say, North Korea, come on. We know you have nuclear weapons. We know why you have nuclear weapons. It's because the United States is threatening you. They're scared of that, and they've achieved a different reality, right? This isn't the Cold War, and I think that's what South Korea is trying to say to the world. We understand maybe why this once existed, but it isn't the future, and it certainly isn't the future economically. And maybe that's also something that none of us is really predisposed to arguing, like, no, this is good for the world stock market. But we had a little hiccup this week in 401k plans. We would see the decimation of 401k plans if there were nuclear war in North Korea. And maybe that would appeal to other people. I'm honestly asking your advice.
So where's the rationality?
I think you put that beautifully. And I wish you could write that as a poem, because there are 4 things that I counted that I would love to amplify. But when you say, where's the rationality, the first problem is that the term rational has been stolen from you. And in the sense that what you just said is in international relations theory defined as irrational. And the problem is, you just spoke truth to power, which is a rational proposition. And I think, when we deal with disciplinary approaches, when we deal with bureaucratic, entrenched proposals, the rational proposal is often defined as either idealist or pipe dream or lefty. But in fact, what you just said is the most realist proposition out there. Why wouldn't North Korea have nuclear weapons? In terms of planning, rational planning, of course they will have nuclear weapons. I'm in complete concurrence, even though I'm opposed to nuclear weapons, but that in 1945, but especially by 1953, if you are a state planner, it's clear that the only definition of state sovereignty is possession of nuclear weapons. And so you're going to begin as a state planner to do this, which leads to my second point to some of your questions, racism. Pure and simple.
Yeah.
We didn't think they could do it. And that even was demonstrated November 29th with North Korea's latest missile test. This, right after Thanksgiving, North Korea achieved an altitude trajectory. How did they do that, was the question. They, being Asian, Korean, other, they did that because, wow, they're pretty good at science. How is science not really knowing racial boundaries? Where does the question come from? The question stems from the idea that if it's not a white man, it's not going to do it. And I'm not trying to, I don't mean any disrespect. What I'm saying is there is a policy, I think Dean Rusk is probably most on record, maybe tongue-in-cheek, maybe not, but he's referring to Dean Acheson talking about, quote-unquote, brown, yellow, little men. And that kind of policy planning was embodied in Mike Pence not standing up the other day in Pyeongchang. Stand up, you're in the host country. Would he have done that in Latvia? I don't know. They're white. But there's this, we can denigrate Asia, and they couldn't possibly come up with a nuclear weapon. I'm sorry, did anybody look at the 1988 differences in literacy in North and South Korea? There was none. I think in 1988, the last time there was an Olympics in Korea, South Korea, the literacy rate in South and North Korea was about 99%, which should humble all of us in Connecticut. And, these are people winning annual math and physics prizes internationally. So the idea that they came up with a nuclear weapon should be a non-starter, but continues to invade thinking in Washington. It's racism. Honestly, this boils down to racism in answer to your question, where's the rational thinking? Well, they couldn't do it.
Well, racism is not an adequate explanation.
I know,
because
right,
we
so it's
still have
part
the
of
same-
it. We're getting,
Yeah.
so we've got the history of it, we've got the economics. The economics is also really significant. In 1945, the North and the South had very different realities coming into being. Kim Jong-un's grandfather, Kim Il-sung, was arguably a pretty legitimate founder of a country because he had been a so-called freedom fighter in Manchuria. He had fought against Japan as a young man. He was 27, 28, 29. He founded North Korea when he was 33 years old. He had charisma. He had actually used bullets against the enemy. Meanwhile, in the South, we had an almost octogenarian who had spent 4 decades at Princeton University and in Washington who could not speak Korean when the United States airlifted him into Seoul in the body of Syngman Rhee. And so you have these very bipolar foundations to the country. Kim Il-sung in the North took a brutal approach to entrenching himself among his people, which was that he totally purged collaborators with the Japanese, former landowners, Christians, so that the first wave of refugees in Korean history, really, were people from North Korea fleeing south because they had worked for Japan. And Kim Il-sung was executing people right, left, and center. At the same time in the South, the American-backed Syngman Rhee had no legitimacy. He, again, could barely speak the language, but on top of that, no South Korean was welcoming him other than those who had worked for the Japanese overlords. And in that, he picked the people still wearing Japanese uniforms in the police, in the military, and we see this today in Iraq and Afghanistan. This is what the United States does. We pick the people on the ground already holding weapons to prove our policies and entrench them. And so in that, we haven't learned much, but those are the foundations. And I guess why I said earlier, and I'm sorry if I've gone on too long, but when I said earlier that last year when the current president of South Korea, who had the courage to shake hands with Kim Jong-un's younger sister, he had the courage to say, okay, you're my enemy, but I've got to know you. He has come through this entire post-colonial history to be South Korean and say, okay, it's time for us not to worry about the first half of the 20th century, but to worry about the future of the 21st century, which is precisely arguably why he recognizes he has to shake hands with the enemy. Because without that, there's only annihilation, which in my definition of rationality is irrational.
He's a Christian man too.
He's Christian, he's Korean,
No,
he's
yeah.
also a pragmatist, and it's interesting, he's defined in international press as a human rights lawyer, but I think in Korean terms that means he's civil rights. And so if we could sort of think about the 1960s and civil rights, the United States, that's who we're dealing with. We're dealing with somebody who came through the struggle for South Korea in South Korea. So there was a civil war between North and South, 50 to 53, but there was also an extended play civil war in South Korea from 1953 to 1993. And that's the background of the man who is the current president, who sees South Korea as a viable country. And that's also, and I'll shut up after this sentence, that's what we need to think about in terms of what we advocate for Korea. Young South Koreans do not want a unified country in terms of one country. We're not talking about the German model. We're not even talking Vietnam. They want a two-state system, maybe even passports. They know they have the same holidays and the same language, and the territory really is the size of Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island, but the economies are bipolar, and they don't feel anymore as if they are the same. Because of capitalism, North Korea is as capitalist. I mean, it's tied to the system. Thus, the sanctions matter. But at the same time, these are separate places. And I've spoken with North Korean defectors who, I say, so where do you see yourself in 20 years? These are 24-year-old North Korean defectors. And I define defector and refugee differently. But a kid who's been in the North Korean army, who's crawled across the 38th parallel, across intensely high voltage wires, which is, the definition of that divide. And I said, where do you see yourself? South or North Korea? In North Korea, building a better North Korea. So that's also something to consider is North Koreans may not, it's very difficult to talk to a North Korean, but they arguably don't see themselves in the same light as South Koreans. So they have two states. Is that workable? And I have disagreed professionally with Victor Cha, the person who's been passed over for ambassador for South Korea. I've disagreed with him on stage, on TV, publicly for the last 30 years of my life. He's my 10-year senior in my world, so he's not like, you don't call him a friend, you call him your senior. But the fact that he, Mr. Hawk, rejected the bloody nose strategy and he is not any longer being considered ambassador is terrifying. And that is what is all of a sudden energized rational thinkers in Washington, because if Victor, who has spent his entire life waiting for this moment, who is hardline, cordon them off, deny them power, whoa, you guys are actually going to bomb them, and he's rejected, it is absolutely horrifying.
If I may continue in all due respect, that it was the Democrats who escalated Vietnam.
Yeah.
It was the Democrats who bombed Yugoslavia and destroyed that country. And once they got what they wanted in Yugoslavia, they bankrolled Kostunica, who did their bidding.
Sure.
So,
And it was a Democratic president who signed Promesa. If you guys don't know, I'll let you know in a minute.
But exactly, no, but I mean, so the point is, we're not talking Democrat and Republican. We are talking, we cannot, as American citizens, allow our country to commit first strike nuclear war.
yeah.
It just comes down to that.
President Trump decided that the arch-conservative Victor Cha was too moderate for his administration. Chilling. At the event, we took up a collection for Puerto Rico. Mildred Guzman, whose family is from Puerto Rico and who traveled there recently, spoke about what she saw.
So when I went to Puerto Rico, I saw great need everywhere I went, it was sad to see my beautiful island. All the trees were still down, but they were trying to survive. You know, I'm so sorry. The trees were trying to come back to life, and this is what the people, it's a reflection of how the people feel. They're trying to survive, you know. So when I was there, my sister and I, we were working with this organization. It started off as a few doctors from New York that are Puerto Rican, and these women went to Puerto Rico to help as doctors in different municipalities, and the people were coming to them, the patients saying, there's no food, there's no water, nobody's helping us, no one's delivering this, and this aid. So they came back to the U.S. and started collecting food and water and medicine. Yale helped out with medicine. Different people, so many Americans gave, because the people of America are beautiful people. It's the government that is messed up, the government that is causing these problems worldwide. When I went to Puerto Rico, we went to orphanages, we went to senior, because they focus on seniors and on children. So we went to different senior centers, we went to orphanages, and we ended up going to a place that helps people that of all ages that are in need of food, or we ended up there by mistake, but we also helped them out. And we helped them out with collections that we made ourselves. People, families, American families, my family, friends, they donated lanterns and batteries and mosquito repellent and food and water, Depends, like for adult diapers, children's, babies' diapers. We delivered so much, my sister and I, through this organization.
And the lesson is no war in Korea, help Puerto Rico instead.
Thank you. Because Puerto Rico demands the debt to be eliminated, because the debt was created by two, for example, of the 7-member control board that they put in Puerto Rico, 2 of them were CEO high up in Santander Bank. And they helped create the debt, because it's so much information that I don't know I can do it all in one night, but they eliminated a law that Puerto Rico had to put a cap on the percentage that these corporations, that these bankers can make. Well, the Santander Bank is charging 9% when the rest of the world is paying 2% at the most. 9%. Anyways, so Puerto Rico demands the debt to be eliminated, and Puerto Rico must be decolonized. We're better off on our own 2 feet.
Amen.
President Moon of South Korea deserves a shout out for sticking his neck way out with his Olympic gesture. The whole thing was not popular, not even with the youth of South Korea. But something had to be done, some desperate act to try to stop the nuclear war momentum. His efforts deserve something back substantial from North Korea. For a start, let the authorities there show the entire Olympics unfiltered on North Korean TV. By the way, you can see all of my comments and Professor Dudden's comments at the teach-in on our YouTube channel. Best way to get there is go to our website, thestruggle.org, and click here, and you'll get to our YouTube page. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller for The Struggle.